Imagine a country where the horizon behaves like a law, where grasslands run for days with no fences to stop the wind, where mountains rise like a sudden verdict at the edge of the steppe, where the land remembers its oldest stories in stone, and still finds a way to aim its newest ambitions into orbit. This is Kazakhstan. Set in the heart of Central Asia, Kazakhstan is a landlocked giant built from contrasts. The southeast turns vertical in the Tien Shan, with glacier-fed valleys and high lakes tucked beneath sharp ridge lines. The center opens into a steppe that makes distance feel physical. The west becomes stark and sculptural, chalk cliffs and desert basins that look like remnants of an ancient seabed. And threaded through every zone is a human story shaped by movement, trade, belief, and modern reinvention. You're watching Era Trails, the channel where we slow down, look closer, and chase the why behind the view. If you're into travel that's more than pretty footage, hit like, subscribe, and stick with us. It helps this series grow, and it tells us to keep making long-form documentaries like this. For this episode, we're following a single spine of meaning, one that feels uniquely Kazakh. We begin with petroglyphs carved into rock, images that outlasted empires and climates. Then we move through a country of shifting environments, canyons and alpine basins, singing dunes and sacred architecture, wetlands that fill the sky with migration, and cities that rise out of open land like declarations. And at the end of the trail, we land on the most audacious contrast of all, a spaceport on the steppe where humanity learned to leave the planet. So settle in. Picture sunlight on carved stone, wind moving through dry grass, cold air rolling off mountain water, and night skies wide enough to hold a space launch. Welcome to Wonders of Kazakhstan. Our journey begins where Kazakhstan's timeline becomes visible at arm's length, carved into the land itself. Kazakhstan doesn't begin with rockets, it begins with rock. Out in the open steppe of Almaty region, the land buckles into low, sun-baked ridges, and a narrow valley starts collecting stories like sediment. This is Tamgaly, a gorge cut into the Chuili Mountains on the western edge of the Tien Shan. In the right light, the stone here looks almost lacquered, darkened by desert varnish, with pale cuts and pecked lines shining through like fresh metal. The geography is simple and brutal in the best way. A dry corridor, rock faces stacked like pages, a thin ribbon of water where it can survive, fed by springs and seasonal flow along the Tamgaly River. Above it, the ridge rises toward Mount Tamgaly, a modest summit by mountain standards, but high enough to turn this gorge into a natural amphitheater for sound, wind, and ritual. Life clings to the margins, and that's part of the visual power. The slopes carry the tough, aromatic texture of steppe and semi-desert, with wormwood and feathergrass dominating the open ground. In spring, brief flashes of color can appear in the wider region as wild tulips push up and vanish again, racing the heat. Overhead, raptors ride the thermals, and the usual cast for this belt includes hunters like the steppe eagle and the Sakar falcon, built for big skies and long distances. Then the human timeline hits, and it hits hard. Across this valley, thousands of images were cut into stone over millennia. The site is famous for around 5,000 petroglyphs, spread across dozens of grouped panels and complexes, with associated archaeology like settlements and burial grounds. The timeline runs from the Bronze Age through later eras, reaching into more recent centuries, which means this isn't one culture leaving a signature. It's a place that kept being returned to. The earliest artists were pastoral people moving with herds, living by weather and water, likely tied to the Andronovo horizon of the steppe. Later layers point to new worlds arriving, Saka-era riders, then Turkic peoples, each generation adding marks the way travelers add cairns to a route that matters. Tamgaly becomes less like an art site and more like a long-running conversation held in the only medium that doesn't rot. Up close, the technique is its own kind of intimacy. Many figures were made by pecking through the dark surface patina to reveal lighter stone beneath, so the images work like negative space, designed to catch sun and shadow. Time then does the rest, softening edges, staining grooves, and making the oldest lines feel like they've always been part of the cliff. And the imagery isn't random. Tamgaly has its icons. One of the most distinctive motifs is the set of sun-headed deities, human bodies topped with radiant circular heads, figures that suggest worship, cosmology, and a belief system built around sky and fire. Nearby come animals that look both symbolic and practical: horses, bulls, deer, and mountain goats, the same creatures that would have meant survival, status, and sacrifice out on the steppe. In other panels, the human world shows itself too: hunting scenes, processions, and moments that feel ceremonial, as if the gorge was a calendar, a temple, and a communal memory all at once. This is why starting here matters, because the theme of this era trail is distance through time. From Tamgaly, Kazakhstan introduces itself as a civilization corridor before it becomes a modern state. Stone messages first, then roads, cities, engines, launch pads. And as the journey keeps moving forward, the question stays the same: what does a land choose to leave behind when it knows the future is coming fast? Leaving Tamgaly, we trade carved stone for open road. We swing back southeast through Almaty region, then cut east, roughly 235 miles, about 380 kilometers, of steppe and long sky before the land finally breaks and drops away. The math works because Tamgaly sits about 170 kilometers northwest of Almaty, and Charyn Canyon is roughly 208.5 kilometers by road from Almaty. So the day becomes a straight line across the map, from ancient symbols to raw geology. And when Charyn reveals itself, it doesn't arrive gently. First, you get the rim: heat, wind, and a horizon that looks ordinary until you step forward and realize the ground has been cut open. This is Charyn Canyon, a long incision running along the Charyn River, close to the Kazakh-Chinese border. The canyon system stretches about 154 kilometers, and in places, the walls fall 150 to 300 meters down toward the riverbed. It's not one single corridor either. It's a whole family of cuts, with named branches like Tamgaly Canyon, Yellow Canyon, Red Canyon, and Bestamak Canyon. But the section that earns its reputation fast is the one we're walking into. Valley of Castles. It's a short side canyon, roughly 2 kilometers of concentrated spectacle, where sedimentary rock has been sculpted into towers and battlements that look engineered, like ruins left behind by something too big to care about symmetry. The palette leans red and orange in hard sunlight, then flips to deep shadow the moment you step between the walls. If Tamgaly was a story you read at arm's length, Valley of Castles is a story that makes you look up until your neck complains. Geologically, this place is a workshop for erosion. The canyon walls are made of layered sedimentary rock, materials laid down, compacted, lifted, and then carved back open by water and wind. The shapes here aren't random. They're the predictable result of fracture lines, softer layers giving way first, harder layers hanging on long enough to form fins, pillars, and cliffs with clean edges. You can see the process in real time. Crumbly slopes undercut by harder ledges, fresh rockfall scars, and talus fans gathering at the base like the canyon is constantly shedding skin. Life in this place runs on contrast, dry above, wet below. Up on the open ground, you're in steppe and semi-desert rhythms. In the plant community above the floodplain, the dominant names read like survival strategies: Saxol, Eurocha, and Ephedra, species built for sun, dryness, and thin soils. Down closer to water, the canyon supports riparian pockets and thickets where the green is louder. Willow, poplar, and barberry start showing up as the river's influence grows. And then there's the ecological jewel hiding in the canyon system, one of the reasons this landscape is protected at all: the Charyn Ash Grove. It sits in the floodplain of the Charyn River in the Saryarka tract. And it's famous because it preserves a relic forest dominated by Sogdian ash, a tree tied to ancient vegetation belts that once stretched wider across the northern Tien Shan slopes. The grove covers about 5,014 hectares, with substantial areas where ash dominates the forest community, surviving floods, drought stress, and shifting floodplain soils. Wildlife follows the same rule as the plants. You find it where the habitat changes. Charyn State National Natural Park is recorded as supporting dozens of mammals and over 100 bird species, because the park isn't one ecosystem. It's steppe, semi-desert, cliffs, and river forest stitched together. Bigger names show up in the park species lists: argali, Siberian ibex, red deer, and wolves, the kind of animals that belong to wide spaces and hard winters. Above the canyon, birds of prey use the uplift from the cliffs, and the lineup can include golden eagles and bearded vultures built for thermals and long patrols. Even the river has its own signature species. So here's the pivot: why this belongs right after Tamgaly. At Tamgaly, we saw people marking stone with meaning. At Charyn, we see the earth doing the same thing, except the scale is brutal and the timeline is indifferent. One place is a record of human belief hammered into rock. The other is a record of wind, water, and uplift hammering the land into shapes that look like architecture. And from here, the trail keeps escalating, because the next chapter pulls us out of canyon heat and into mountain air, toward the high country of Kolsai lakes, where water stops being a thin river line and becomes a chain of alpine basins. Leaving the red stone drama of Charyn Canyon, the route bends southeast into higher country. The cliffs fall away in the rear view, the air cools, and the horizon starts stacking into folds. Foothills first, then the hard blue silhouette of the Tien Shan. This is the shift Kazakhstan does so well. 1 hour you're in a wind-carved canyon, and a little later you're climbing toward lakes that look like they were poured into the mountains and left to set. The gateway here is Sati, a small village that feels like a last human pause before the wilderness takes over. Beyond it, the road threads into the north slope of the Kungoi-Alatu range, where spruce forests tighten around the valley, and the land turns alpine by degrees. This entire chapter lives inside Kolsai Lakes National Park, a protected slice of the northern Tien Shan that locals often describe as Kazakh Switzerland, not because it's trying to imitate Europe, but because the combination of dark conifers, steep slopes, and cold, clean water hits that same nerve in the eye. The first reveal is Lower Kolsai Lake. Long, narrow, and shockingly still when the wind drops. The shoreline is a clean visual, forest on one side, open water on the other, and mountains closing the frame like a backdrop that refuses to be background. The lake sits at about 1,818 meters, and you feel that elevation in the light, sharper, brighter, and a little less forgiving. Along the edges, Shrenk's spruce crowds the bank in tight, dark stands, and after rain, the understory pops with mushrooms and wet earth smell. This is also where the wildlife starts to quietly announce itself. Look for ripples and flashes in the shallows. Rainbow trout are one of the lake's most famous residents. Overhead, the mountain sky turns into a raptor corridor. In this park, birds like the golden eagle and the soccer falcon belong to the ecosystem, not the highlight reel. And in the quieter margins, where forest shadow meets meadow, the park is home to rare mammals most visitors never see: the snow leopard, the Turkistan lynx, and the pale, powerful Tien Shan brown bear that moves through this range like a rumor with footprints. From the lower shoreline, the valley becomes a corridor. The Kolsai River runs south to north here, and following it feels like walking into deeper layers of the same painting: water, forest, slope, sky, repeated with new angles. The climb is gradual at first, with the sound of current and birds replacing the road noise, and the trees closing overhead into a cooler, greener tunnel. Then the trail breaks into small, open pockets where the mountains finally show their full shape. Ridgelines, scree, and the kind of carved terrain that tells you glaciers and landslides have had their say. 5 kilometers upstream sits the most photographed scene in the park: Middle Kolsai Lake, also known as Mincholki, a name that carries the meaning of 1,000 years old. This is the lake that earns the Pearl's nickname: water turning deep green-blue, slopes dropping straight into the basin, and spruce reflections so clean they look like a second forest under glass. The elevation jumps to about 2,252 meters, and the ecosystem shifts with it. More alpine meadow breaks, sharper temperature swings, and an atmosphere that feels both calmer and more exposed. Above Mangystau, the route climbs again into thinner air and quieter ground. Upper Kolsai Lake sits around 2,850 meters, where spruce starts giving way to open alpine meadows and rock-strewn slopes. The lake feels more remote, more earned, less destination, more edge of the map. And beyond it is a named threshold that explains how close this landscape is to becoming true high country travel. Saryarka Pass, rising to about 3,278 meters, a route that turns this valley into a multi-day corridor rather than a simple hike. But the most surreal image in this national park isn't one of the Kolsai trio. It's a detour into a side gorge toward a lake that looks like a glitch in reality. That detour leads to Lake Kandy, sitting at roughly 2,000 meters, and from the first glimpse, it doesn't behave like a normal mountain lake. The water is an unnatural blue-green, and out of it rises a forest of dead trunks. Pale masts, perfectly vertical, like the lake drowned a stand of trees and kept the skeleton as a monument. These are submerged Shrinks spruce, preserved by cold water, their bark stripped away until the wood turns ghost white above the surface. Kandy exists because the mountains here are still active in the most literal sense. In 1911, a major earthquake, the Kebun event, triggered a limestone landslide that dammed a gorge and created the basin. Water filled the new bowl, the forest stayed standing, and Kazakhstan ended up with one of the strangest, most cinematic lakes on the planet. In calm weather, trunks reflect so perfectly that the scene doubles itself, sky above, sky below, and a drowned forest holding the center line. And this is why Kolsai Lakes National Park belongs on our trail. After the carved stone and open air of Charyn, this chapter changes the texture of the journey, from desert edge drama into alpine water, spruce shadow, and high mountain quiet. It's Kazakhstan showing range, not a single landscape, but a sequence, and each one feels like it was made to be filmed. Leaving the spruce shadow quiet of Kolsai and Kandy, we drop out of the high valleys and drive northwest into a different Kazakhstan. Wider, drier, and louder with wind. From the Kolsai Lakes area, it's about 330 kilometers to Bashi, the main gateway village for Altyn-Emel. The mountains don't disappear, they just step back, flattening into long horizons until the land starts looking like a stage built for mirages. Altyn-Emel State National Nature Park sits in the Ili River Valley, spread between the Ili River and the pale ridges of the Aksu Mountains, a protected desert steppe world created in 1996. The textures change fast here. Sand seas, gravel plains, rocky low mountains, the kind of landscape where sunlight feels heavier because there's nothing to soften it. The approach is all open frame visuals, a hard road line, a huge sky dome, and vegetation that looks sparse until you learn the names. The foothill plains carry tough desert plants like Ili Saksal and Tereskin, species built for heat, wind, and thin soils. Even the shrubs feel engineered, low, dense, and stubborn, gripping sand the way roots grip a promise. Then the wildlife starts showing itself in silhouettes and distance. This park is a stronghold for the kulan, the Asiatic wild ass, a conservation story with real weight, with reintroduction work dating back to 1982 and one of the world's largest free-ranging populations now moving through this desert steppe. Add the quick, elegant lines of goitered gazelle. Before the dune, Altyn-Emel drops another time marker into the frame. Out near the Ili River, the land rises into the Beshatyr Mounds, 5 tenths in Kazakh, a complex of Saka royal burial kurgans from the first millennium BC. From a distance they read like low pyramids on the plain, the kind of shapes that make you understand how nomadic empires turned open land into a map of power. And then the signature wonder starts forming ahead, like a ship on the horizon. The Singing Dune, also known as Aigaikum, rises on the right bank of the Ili River, pinned between the Big Kalkan Mountains and the Small Kalkan Mountains. From Bashi, it's roughly 46 kilometers into the park, and the dune appears as a clean, pale wedge against darker rock. A single shape so precise it looks placed, not formed. Up close, the scale lands properly. The main dune runs about 3 kilometers in length and reaches about 150 meters high, with a second ridge nearby around 100 meters, spread across roughly 240 hectares of sand. It's a true Barchan form, crescent-backed, wind-built. But what makes it unforgettable isn't the shape. It's the fact that this mountain of sand can speak. When conditions hit, hot, dry air, and moving wind, the sand grains shear and slide, and the dune produces a deep, resonant hum that people compare to an organ note, a distant engine, a low thunder that doesn't belong to the sky. You climb into that sound with every step, boots sinking, sand shifting, the crest sharpening into a clean line of light. Then you stop, and the landscape does its trick, the dune singing with no instrument in sight, just physics turning motion into voice. And that's why this chapter sits perfectly after Kolsai. We've gone from cold alpine water to hot desert sand, from forests reflected in lakes to a dune that makes its own soundtrack. Kazakhstan isn't just changing scenery on us, it's changing elements, stone, water, wind. And next, the trail keeps marching forward through time, from natural wonder back into human-built meaning, as the Silk Road heartlands begin to pull us toward Turkistan. Leaving the wind-sculpted sand of Altyn-Emel, we turn the wheel southwest, trading the Ili River Valley for the long level pull of the southern steppe. It's a serious reposition on the map. Roughly 1,030 kilometers, about 640 miles, by road from Altyn-Emel National Park to Turkistan. A drive that feels like Kazakhstan, stretching its legs between landscapes. The approach to Turkistan is all horizon and heat shimmer. This is southern Kazakhstan near the Saryarka River, where settlement historically clung to water and irrigation at the edge of desert country. The older town grew as an oasis on the frontier between nomadic steppe life and the settled cities of Central Asia, fed by canals and waterways flowing down from the Katon Mountains. You can feel that borderland ecology in the visuals around the city. Beyond the streets, the land reads steppe, dry ground, wind, and hardy plants built for sun and thin moisture. The kind of terrain where wormwood and feather grass define the scent and texture of distance. And wherever the Saryarka holds its ground, the palette flips into riparian life. Tugay river forest strips stitched along the floodplain, anchored by Euphrates poplar, and mixed with willows, tamarisk, and reed beds of phragmites. Then the skyline locks in, and the tone changes with it. The mausoleum of Khoja Ahmed Yasawi doesn't appear so much as it asserts itself. A massive brick form rising out of flat land, crowned by a turquoise dome that catches sunlight like polished stone. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site built under Timur between 1389 and 1405, and it's considered one of the largest and best preserved monuments of the Timurid period. A building where master builders experimented with structural ideas that later shaped architecture in Samarkand. From the outside, the visuals are pure geometry and authority. The monumental entrance portal, walls faced in patterned tile, and bands of script that turn the facade into both decoration and declaration. You don't need to understand the text to feel the intent. This was built to be seen across the steppe, to make distance come to it. Step inside, and the space does what great sacred architecture always does. It changes the scale of your body. You enter the main hall, Kazandik, a vast square chamber capped by a brick dome. This is the largest conic spherical dome of its kind in Central Asia. Light drops in from above, edges soften, and the building starts speaking in echo instead of ornament. At the center sits the object that anchors the entire interior, the bronze cauldron known as Taikazan. And then the building starts unfolding, room by room, like a complex machine designed for devotion. The mausoleum holds roughly 35 rooms, spaces for prayer, meeting, study, and shelter. A multifunctional konica, rather than a single-purpose tomb. Look up for the carved, stalactite-like muqarnas forms, then follow corridors into quieter chambers where color returns in fragments. Pale blues, floral geometry, and the disciplined repetition that makes Islamic design feel infinite without ever being chaotic. This is the pivot point of our trail. Because after Tamgaly, we've been watching Kazakhstan speak through land. Canyon walls, alpine water, singing sand. Here the country speaks through structure and belief, through a shrine that turned Turkistan into a spiritual magnet for the steppe, a place people travel toward instead of through. Then once you've stood beneath that dome, with the steppe outside and centuries inside, the theme sharpens. Kazakhstan isn't just a place of vast landscapes. It's a place that learned to hold deep time in stone and then keep moving forward. Next, we leave the sacred core behind and head back into wild altitude, toward the western Tien Shan, where the country's biodiversity and mountain geology start flexing again. From the turquoise weight of Turkistan, we turn east into the mountains, about 267 kilometers across southern Kazakhstan, and you feel the country tighten. The flat, sun-blown steppe gives way to foothills, then ridgelines, then real elevation. Where Turkistan was built to pull pilgrims in, this landscape pulls you upward into cooler air and sharper light. This is the Aksu-Zhabagly Nature Reserve, folded into the Talas Alatau of the western Tien Shan. And it isn't just a park. It's the oldest nature reserve in Central Asia, founded in 1926, protecting an elevation ladder that runs roughly from 1,100 meters up to 4,236 meters at Seyram Peak. In a single region, you can move from dry mountain foothills to alpine meadows to snow-lined terrain where the mountains stop being scenery and start being weather. Zoom out for a second, and the context gets even bigger. This region sits inside the transnational UNESCO World Heritage Property, Western Tien Shan, a mountain system that spans 700 to 4,503 meters and is globally important for biodiversity, including being a center of origin for cultivated fruit crops and hosting a mix of forest types and unique plant communities. This isn't pretty wilderness. This is living infrastructure for genetics, evolution, and survival. Then spring hits, and the foothills turn into a color event. The slopes around Aksu-Zhabagly are famous for wild tulips, not garden ornaments, but originals. You can find Gregg's tulip, the reserve symbol, and Kaufmann's tulip, both counted among the wild ancestors of the tulips the world later domesticated and exported into history. It's one of those visuals that feels too clean to be real. Red and yellow cups scattered across green ground, with snowy ridges parked behind them like a second horizon. Water is what carves the next sequence. The Aksu River drops into Aksu Canyon, a hard incision, about 15 kilometers long and roughly 500 meters deep, where cliffs rise like walls and the gorge becomes its own world. On the rim, you're in bright wind and open sky. Down below, you're suddenly in shadow, with rock faces towering above a ribbon of moving water. It's one of the largest canyons in Central Asia, and it feels like the land switched from steppe to cathedral without warning. And then the forest story shows up, not as one uniform woodland, but as a patchwork shaped by altitude and exposure. Wildlife here plays by mountain rules. You rarely get a clean, close reveal. You get signs, distance, silhouettes, and sudden movement. The reserve is specifically noted for rare and endemic animals like the European glass lizard, the white-winged woodpecker, the beech marten, and the Menspear's marmot. And yes, even the snow leopard belongs to this system. In fact, UNDP notes that camera traps recorded a snow leopard here at around 2,900 meters, which tells you exactly what kind of altitude wilderness we're dealing with. This is why this chapter sits where it does in our trail. We started with Tamgaly, where humans carved meaning into stone. We moved through canyons and lakes and singing dunes, landscapes that feel like the planet showing off. And now, in the western Tien Shan, Kazakhstan reveals the biological engine underneath all that beauty. A vertical world where flowers, rivers, forests, and apex predators stack by elevation like floors in a living tower. Next, we leave the green heights behind and push west into a harsher palette, toward Mangystau and the UstyurtPlateau, where the land turns chalk-white, skeletal, and almost extraterrestrial. From the green altitude of the western Tien Shan, we swing the compass hard west. This is one of those Kazakhstan reposition moves where the country reminds you how big it is. From the Shymkent region, you're looking at roughly 1,547 kilometers as the crow flies to Mangystau, and well over 2,100 kilometers by road. The mountains don't fade into plains so much as dissolve into distance until the palette turns pale and the land starts feeling mineral. The modern gateway is Aktau, sitting on the shore of the Caspian Sea, a blue edge that feels almost shocking after days of interior steppe. From here you push inland into the Mangystau region, where much of the ground is built from ancient marine sediments shaped by desert wind into hollows, ridges, and stark sculptural forms. It's a landscape with a deep ocean memory, the kind of place where cliffs look like sliced seabed because at different times in Earth's story, that's exactly what they were. And then you hit the wall. The UstyurtPlateau is a vast, flat, semi-desert tableland, but its defining feature is its edge. The Ustyurt Chink, a line of escarpments, cliffs and vertical walls, built from layers of limestone and chalk compressed over millions of years at the bottom of an ancient sea. Wind and time have chewed those layers into clean faces and strange silhouettes, so the plateau reads less like flat land and more like a gigantic geological stage set. Inside that stage is the headline, Wonder Bojira, also spelled Boshira, one of the most iconic tracks on the plateau. The first big visual is the upper viewpoint, where white slopes fall away into a basin of chalk and shadow, and isolated formations rise like monuments in a cathedral that has no roof. The signature shapes are the twin spires locals call the Fangs, Azu-Tisteri, two towering remnants that thrust out of the chalk like teeth, each reaching roughly 200 meters high. Up close, the ground texture becomes the story. Pale chalk underfoot, plates of limestone, loose rubble that crunches like dry bone, and ridges cut by ephemeral runoff channels that only carry water when the sky decides to. In certain light, sunrise or late afternoon, the whole tract flips from white to gold, and every fold in the terrain becomes readable. Old layers, new scars, and erosion doing slow-motion architecture. Life here is subtle, but it's not absent. It's specialized. Across the sands and saline soils of western Kazakhstan, vegetation is built to survive heat, wind, and low water. Black saxaul and white saxaul, salt-tolerant shrubs like saltwort, and low, tough steppe communities described as wormwood fescue vegetation. In spring, brief flashes of ephemerals can appear and vanish again, a whole season condensed into days. The fauna matches the terrain, fast, wary, and tuned to distance. The broader Ustyurt ecosystem is known for rare steppe animals like the saiga antelope, the goitered gazelle, often called Charyn, and the Ustyurt mouflon, with predators like wolves and jackals moving the same open country. And then the story pivots from geology into devotion. Because Mangystau isn't only alien cliffs, it's also one of Kazakhstan's strongest pilgrimage landscapes, where sacred sites sit in the same harsh terrain and still pull people in. The most famous of these is Beket Ata, an underground mosque carved into rock in the Oglandi Tract in the foothills of the UstyurtPlateau. From Aktau, it's a remote desert journey, often described as about 230 kilometers east, ending not at a skyline, but at a cliff face and a descent. Beket Ata is tied to Beket Mirza Gulali, a revered Sufi figure with sources dating the mosque to the 18th century. The entrance sequence is pure visual storytelling, a rugged valley, pale rock, and a stairway dropping toward a cut in the cliff, where the sacred space is literally inside the stone. This is why Mangystau lands where it does in our era trail. We've moved from carved stone at Tamgaly, to canyon architecture at Charyn, to alpine water at Kolsai, to singing sand in Altyn-Emel, to sacred monumentality in Turkistan, and to biodiversity towers in the western Tien Shan. Here, Kazakhstan turns the dial again, chalk-white planetscapes and underground prayer rooms. Ancient sea, ancient faith, both sitting under the same massive sky. And that sky is the point. Because when this trail finally reaches its end, when we arrive at launch pads and flame and orbit, Kazakhstan's story will feel continuous. From marks in rock to engines that leave the Earth behind. From the chalk-white silence of Mangystau, we aim for the country's wide northern heart. The line runs northeast, about 1,736 kilometers from Aktau to Astana, and then another 129 kilometers out toward the wetlands of Korgalchen. It's a hard reset, alien cliffs behind us, and ahead a horizon so flat and open it looks like the sky is resting directly on the grass. This is Saryarka, Yellow Range, the great steppe and lake mosaic of northern Kazakhstan, protected as the UNESCO World Heritage Site Saryarka, steppe and lakes of northern Kazakhstan. It's not one postcard landscape, it's a living system, temperate grassland stretching into wetland basins that act like refueling stations for migration on a continental scale. Out on the open steppe, the visuals are clean and relentless. Wind combs through feather grass and fescue with wormwood, adding that dry, bitter edge to the scent of the land. There are almost no vertical lines here, just grass, sky, and the slow movement of clouds. And that emptiness is exactly what makes the next scene hit so hard. Because then, the water appears. The wetland core is the Korgalchen State Nature Reserve, built around the Tengiz-Korgalchen Lake System. A spread of shallow lakes, reed beds, and mudflats that look like mirrors from above, and labyrinths from the shoreline. The star name here is Lake Tengiz, a huge saline basin where the edge of the water is often bright with mineral crust, and the shallows turn silver when the sun is high. This is where Kazakhstan becomes a sky documentary. In peak seasons, these lakes provide feeding grounds for up to 15 to 16 million birds, including migratory flocks of up to 2.5 million geese. You don't spot birds here. You watch moving weather made of wings, lines and spirals crossing the wetlands as if the air itself has currents only they can see. And then the color arrives. Greater flamingos gather on Lake Tengiz and the scene turns unreal. Pale pink bodies against blue water and beige steppe, a colony living at the far northern edge of where flamingos should feel possible. It's one of those rare visuals that look staged until you remember migration doesn't care about what we think belongs where. It only cares about food, water, and timing. The wetlands aren't just spectacle. They're sanctuary for threatened species. The Kurgaljan and Tengiz lakes are recognized under the Ramsar Convention, and they're known to host globally threatened birds like the white-headed duck in significant numbers during breeding and migration seasons. In the reeds and open water, the rare becomes normal, simply because the habitat still works the way it's supposed to. Then the story widens, because Saryarka isn't only Kurgaljan. Farther northwest lies Naurzum State Nature Reserve, set on the Turkistan Plateau within the Great Turkey Depression. A region where steppe, lakes, and forest patches collide in a way that feels almost impossible this far south in the grassland belt. Here, the visuals shift from endless plain to a surprising mix: open steppe, lake chains, and islands of woodland rising out of the flat like mirages that decided to become permanent. The forest is the twist. The reserve's signature is the Naurzum pine forest, with Scots pine growing on dunes, backed by groves of birch and aspen. Along the lake edges, the frame fills with reeds and sedges, and the landscape starts looking like a stitched border between two worlds. Steppe on one side, wetland on the other, and the wildlife follows that stitching. In the open country, you get steppe silhouettes and quick movement, Korsak fox, and the burrow world of marmots. In the wider system, even the saiga antelope still belongs to the story. A reminder that the steppe isn't empty land. It's a habitat with its own fragile giants. This is why Saryarka sits perfectly in our era trail. We began with humans carving meaning into stone at Tamgaly. We crossed deserts, canyons, dunes, monuments, and mountains. Here, the country becomes a living crossroads, not just for people, but for migration itself. A place where continents connect through wetlands and timing, and where the sky fills with proof that Kazakhstan is not only vast, it's essential. From Saryarka, where the sky turns into a conveyor belt of wings, we point the journey east, toward the mountains that don't just shape weather, they shape borders. This is the long haul across Kazakhstan's width, roughly 1,000 kilometers from the capital region to the far eastern Katon-Karagay district, where the map tightens into a four-cornered frontier of Kazakhstan, Russia, China, and Mongolia. The entry point is East Kazakhstan region, and the transition is visual. The steppe smooths out behind you, birch patches start appearing like islands, and the horizon begins to wrinkle. Low ridges first, then the real wall of the southern Altai Mountains. This is where Kazakhstan stops being wide and starts being vertical, a place of glaciated slopes, river-cut valleys, and air that smells like resin instead of dust. The protected core is Katon-Karagay National Park, founded in 2001, and often described as the largest national park in Kazakhstan, an immense mountain landscape covering 643,477 hectares. It's not a single view, it's an entire altitude ladder. Forests below, subalpine meadows above, then rock, snowfields, and ice where the land becomes raw geometry. Down in the valleys, everything is built around water. The frame keeps finding the Bukhtarma River basin, with side valleys threading in like veins, clear streams running fast over stone, and conifer forests crowding their banks. This is the Altai's signature rhythm: a riverline, a forest wall, and a mountain roof sitting close enough to feel like it's leaning over you. Then the road starts climbing into named places that feel like they were designed for travel documentaries. One of the iconic routes is the old high track known as the Old Austrian Road, a rough mountain passage through the park that's often described as about 60 kilometers long and tied to a very specific history. It was built between 1915 and 1917 by Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war. The visual is all switchbacks and altitude, forest dropping away, ridge lines stacking ahead, and the sense that you're driving into a borderland that doesn't care if you're ready. Once you're deeper in, the Altai starts handing out water landmarks like a checklist of extremes. You get high lakes held in intermountain basins. Lake Bukhtarma is one of the named anchors here. Set at roughly 2,064 meters above sea level in the Kazakh Altai, with small rivers feeding in from moraine country. Even the distances feel like a flex. The route from Oskamin to Lake Bukhtarma is sited at about 523 kilometers, and parts of it aren't paved because out here, remoteness is part of the ecosystem. And then comes the place that changes the mood entirely. Rachmaninoff Springs, hot mineral water in cold mountain air perched near Lake Rachman, with waterfalls and conifer slopes wrapping the basin. It's the kind of contrast that only mountains do well. Steam rising from water while snow still lingers on the high ridges, and everything around you smelling like wet pine and stone. Above the forest belt, the geology turns glacial. Katon-Karagay is described as mountainous and glaciated, with higher ridges opening into alpine zones and snow fields, terrain that reads as cirques, moraines, and sharp-edged valleys sculpted by ice. And looming nearby, across the borderline of the Altai system, is the peak that dominates the mythos of this whole mountain world. Belukha Mountain, the highest point in the Altai, at 4,506 meters. Even when you don't stand on it, you feel it as a presence, because in the Altai, the highest ground dictates the entire skyline. The biology here is just as layered as the terrain. Lower elevations carry meadow steppe and mixed forest. Mid-elevations stack into subalpine conifer zones where the names become the visuals. Siberian pine, larch, and birch are repeatedly cited as dominant trees in the park's forest belts. Higher up, the green thins into tundra-like vegetation, mosses, lichens, and tough alpine plants clinging to rock edges near snowfields. And the fauna matches the altitude. The park's recorded vertebrate diversity is huge, hundreds of species across birds and mammals. And the headline animals belong to the remote mountains category: brown bear, wolf, and deer moving the forest edge. And then there's the apex signature of Central Asian high country, the snow leopard, documented here as a rare resident, with modern camera traps even capturing it in the Altai portion of Kazakhstan. In a landscape this vast, that's how top predators announce themselves, not with sightings, but with proof. Before we leave the Altai, the Eritreal's theme clicks back into place. because this frontier isn't only wilderness, it's memory. Near the village of Beryl, the land holds the Beryl Mounds, a concentration of about 100 burial structures and memorial sites associated with early Saka kurgans dating roughly to the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE. After starting our journey at Tamgaly, Kazakhstan keeps doing this. It hides deep time in plain sight and then asks you to notice it. This is the far edge of the country's wild, where forests go dark, rivers run cold, and the mountains start touching 3 other nations. And it's the perfect setup for what comes next in our trail. After the Altai, the story doesn't get bigger in landscape. It gets bigger in ambition, because Kazakhstan's timeline is still accelerating, and we're heading toward the places where the modern era stops living on the land and starts launching beyond it. From the forested height of Katon-Karagay, we swing the trail northwest across the interior, roughly 1,270 kilometers of road that trades mountain shadow for open steppe light. The trees thin, the land flattens, and the sky starts behaving like it did back in Saryarka, wide enough to make scale feel personal. Then the capital rises out of that flatness like a deliberate interruption. Astana sits on the Ishim River, a modern city placed in a landscape built for distance, where winter can feel absolute and the wind has nothing to negotiate with. Even the name carries the reset. The city was renamed Nur Sultan in 2019 and switched back to Astana in 2022. And Astana's skyline doesn't try to blend in, it tries to declare. The first symbol is Baytarek, a white lattice tower crowned with a golden sphere planted on the city's ceremonial axis like a beacon. It was built as a symbol of the capital's move to Astana in 1997. And the monument leans hard into Kazakh myth, the Tree of Life, and the legendary bird Samruk, laying an egg high in its branches. Up close, the structure is all engineered filigree, steel ribs climbing into the sky, then tightening into that amber glass globe that catches sunlight and throws it back like a signal. From that height, the visuals finally explain the city. The river bends, the boulevards stretch straight. The steppe sits beyond everything, like an ocean you can't drain. And you understand the point. Astana isn't trying to be ancient, it's trying to be a future-shaped monument built on open land. Then you follow the line forward to the next statement piece, Khan Shatyr. It rises at the end of the city's formal axis as a transparent tent the size of a landmark, an engineered yurt memory, scaled up into something almost unreal. Designed by Foster and Partners, the structure soars to about 150 meters, springing from a huge elliptical base and enclosing more than 100,000 square meters of indoor city, park space, leisure zones, and a climate-controlled world meant to stay livable even when the steppe outside is punishing. The material is part of the spectacle, a tensile shell that turns daylight into a soft glow, and at night becomes a lit canopy against the dark. Inside, the visuals shift again, an indoor street feeling, open plazas, and a curated version of comfort that makes sense only when you remember where you are. A capital built in a climate of extremes. This stop matters in our era trail because it's Kazakhstan writing in a different medium. Tamgaly carved the story into stone. Astana builds the story into skyline. It's the same impulse. Leave a mark that survives the weather. Only now, it's expressed through steel, glass, and geometry. From the first cut in stone at Tamgaly, we walked a timeline you can actually see. Charyn turning rock into architecture. Kolsai and Candy holding forests under glass. Altyn-Emel teaching sand to sing. Turkistan lifting devotion into turquoise and brick. The western Tien Shan stacking life by altitude. Mangystau carving an ancient seabed into chalk-white cathedrals and hiding prayer inside the earth. Saryarka filling the sky with migration. The Altai drawing borders in snow and pine. Astana building the future into the skyline. If this film gave you that feeling, the one where a map stops being a map and becomes a story, then help us keep making these. Like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you want the next era trail to go. We read them, we build from them, and they shape the route. Thank you for traveling with us through wonders of Kazakhstan. Until the next trail, wherever the world pulls us, we'll see you there.